Well, here we are again. Another teen romance novel with a kinda sorta unique premise being brought to the silver screen. I mean, really, that's what we're dealing with from Hollywood now, is just a bunch of teen novel adaptations struggling and trying oh so hard to be the next Twilight or to be the next Harry Potter. Just, yeah. One, I know you're sick of hearing this, but I have not read the book, so all my opinions herein are based solely on the film. Like I said, a film adaptation needs to be able to stand on its own. That said, going into this, I was kind of expecting a Twilight clone. Because, well, I don't know, I've just kind of become jaded because there's just so many films being made on so many teen novels, some of them being stuck in development hell, just ask John Green. And, well, you can kind of see that my opinions going into it would probably not be that high. Thankfully, however, this film wasn't a Twilight clone. It managed to set itself apart with its unique atmosphere and the kind of the world it created. However, even with the world that it created and even with some of the good story elements, there were some elements that were underdeveloped. A lot of it felt like that they were characters and story aspects that were important and really pivotal in the novel that they just couldn't quite translate to film, but they knew they had to include or the story wouldn't make sense, even though their inclusion just makes things a tad more confusing and just feel unnecessary. I mean, I haven't read the book, so I don't care if there is like a character that's included if they're not really contributing to the story. It's the whole Tom Bombadil debate here. That said, it's got a pretty unique atmosphere, and the story itself is pretty unique and pretty interesting, and the relationship between our two romantic leads is at least a lot healthier than the relationships depicted in Twilight. I know a lot of people are sick like, oh, stop comparing it to Twilight. That's what I've been seeing on a bunch of review sites, but the comparisons already are being made. Deal with it. On the visual side of things, it also has some pretty cool imagery with like the flashbacks and the way things work with the magic and like the way certain spells that are cast look. But when you get into the real like hardcore spell casting, like the whole spinning table scene or just like the attack magic, it gets a little too over the top for my taste, and not in a good way. I mean, there's a right way to go over the top where you just wholeheartedly embrace it, whereas this one is just kind of, well, we're just gonna stick with our unique style, but not quite go all the way into the whole magic thing. We're still gonna try to make it look cool, but not quite go all the way into it. That's how I felt. I mean, for the most part, the magic and a lot of the visual effects and visual aesthetics with the flashbacks and everything looked cool. It's just there were scenes where it felt like they didn't fully commit to it. And I can understand that maybe there was only so much they could do based on the descriptions in the novel, depending on how faithful they were trying to be. But that's how it felt, particularly during the climax of the film, during the final scene where there's like this epic showdown. It could have been a lot more epic. Again, haven't read the novel, so I don't know how faithful it is, but in my opinion, the whole climax of the story could have been a lot more epic, and they could have made it more epic visually. There's not really much else to say from a technical aspect. I mean, it's got good pacing. The dialogue's okay, although not that memorable. It's well edited, and there's some cool cinematography moments, but nothing really noteworthy. Now, the acting, well, the acting was pretty par for the course. I mean, I like Jeremy Irons as much as the next guy, and so having him in the film, it was a nice little enjoyable thing. But the acting was just kind of a case of, well, they're good actors. There's nothing that really stood out. There's nothing really like, oh, that person did such a great delivery of this line. It was just a case of, well, they know what they're doing. They're professionals. It's kind of par for the course. It's what's expected from them as actors. So there's nothing really memorable. The only reason I really remember Jeremy Irons is because I like Jeremy Irons. So overall, the film was a lot better than I expected. Although it goes over a lot of the same tropes from teen romance and urban fantasy fiction, it's still a pretty well put together film and definitely a better example of a young adult fiction story. At least when it's adapted to film. It's definitely a better example than some of the other things that have become popular in recent years. Point being, it's a good film. It is what it is. It's not really a case where you're gonna see something that transcends its target demographic, but if you go in knowing what you're getting into, knowing that it's meant for teenagers, it's a love story first and a fantasy story second, you'll enjoy it if you go in for what it is. Don't go in like expecting something completely groundbreaking, mind-blowing, and all that jazz. It basically is what it is. if you go in knowing that, you'll enjoy it. If you're into the sort of thing, you might be willing to pay full price for it. Personally, I'm a bit of a cheapskate, and with this film, I probably would wait for the dollar theater, but not nearly as much as certain other films that I've reviewed this year so far. So on my personal scale, I'm giving Beautiful Creatures a 4 out of 5. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. As for next week, I'll be reviewing Dark Skies. See you then. Okay, end screen time. Click here to see my previous review of Identity Thief. Click here for a random video. There's not really much else for me to rant about that would be relevant to this video. I mean, coming this next Wednesday, I have an article talking about books that haven't been made into movies that you should read. So I'll just give you a brief rundown of what I said there because the article's not going to be up until Wednesday. But basically, the books that I chose for that article that haven't been made into movies yet. Number 3, The Fault in Our Stars. Although there's a movie version in development, given the track record for John Green's other books trying to be made into movies, it's probably not going to get very far. I mean, Abundance of Catherines didn't get very far. Paper Towns didn't get very far because there was disagreements about what made a good movie between John Green and the production studio. The whole, oh, audiences don't like smart teenagers debate. So, before the movie, if the movie gets made, you may want to read it before the movie gets made and gets its full wing so you can fully enjoy it in the style in which it's written and in which it was originally created. That, John Green's a good author. As for the next set of books I recommended, well, in my number 2 slot I recommended the Circle of Magic Quartet by Tamora Pierce. Now, I haven't read the whole quartet. I've only read Sandry's book and part of Triss's book when I first read it. And, well, I enjoyed the stories. I mean, it was almost kind of like a different take on the whole kids learning magic thing, except I kind of like this better than Harry Potter because at least this one just fully embraced the fact that it was a fantasy world instead of trying to tie it to the real world, which can work, but that's just personal preference. And so Circle of Magic Quartet was the number 2 slot, and the number 1 book I recommended that you should read that hasn't been made into a movie yet and probably won't be made into a movie, well, ever, Catcher in the Rye. I mean, Salinger's gone out of his way to make sure that no major adaptations were going to be made during his life. I mean, the one time he was considering making an adaptation was a play in which he himself would be starring as Holden Caulfield. So that was the number 1 book I say that, a book that isn't a movie yet, in parentheses, that you should read, Catcher in the Rye. Yeah, and this Enslate thing's probably gone on long enough because this is going to be a real pain in the ass to edit, so yeah. Not really much else for me to say. I do have some other videos planned throughout this next week. And I still have Romney's Retro Challenge to edit through, so yeah. I better get back to that. Yeah. I'm not musically talented.